So this will provide our city with a new crisis response alternative to non-violent, non-medical emergency calls, better helping to address the underlying health issues and better helping our neighbors in the moment of need, often in the moment of crisis.
Well, that's Mayor Bruce Harrell talking about a new investment he wants to make in what's now called the CARE Department, Community Assistance, Response, and Engagement, that third public safety department to respond to lower acuity 911 calls. What will that investment look like, and what other investments are in store as the mayor lays out his budget proposal this week? Plus, the push to change the way the city clears or sweeps homeless encampments. All these stories and a whole lot more percolating this week on Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan, and I am joined by my intrepid co-host, the one and only David Croman, reporter for the Seattle Times. And David, we are recording this show just after a Mariners loss you saw in person against the Astros. And I got to ask, what was worse, watching the M's get dominated by Justin Verlander or following the game on Twitter? Your thoughts?
I know, right? Yeah, I don't know. It was about it was cold, it was wet. It was as depressing of a game as I've been to be honest.
Oh, man, I know. It's been rough watching these guys. So we'll see how it goes for the M's. It's make or break it time here in the last week of the regular season here. Thank you very much, David, for joining me. Thanks to our background noise sponsor, City Grind Espresso on the first floor of City Hall. Thanks also to our show patrons. Our shout out of the week goes to Britt, who's been a patron for the past several months. Her support, very much appreciated. If you're listening, folks, please do become a patron. We are here to answer your questions about city politics, anything you got on your mind. And for just $5 a month, you can get this highly sought-after Seattle News, Views, and Brews decal. Send in your photos of that sticker in action on the fridge or travel mug. We will feature them on our Sticker Shots segment, which you can see on Converge Media. Converge airs the video version of our podcast Wednesday nights at 7 o'clock. Thank you, Converge, and thank you, Britt. All right, let's get cooking with right here, right now. Well, we are releasing this show just before the mayor makes his official budget announcement for the year, what the city calls a mid-biennium budget adjustment. To put it in perspective, it's a little bit like when the state legislature has a short session because they did the longer 2-year budget planning session the year before. This budget year for the council is basically like that. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't some wrangling going on, and in particular, the mayor's request for a $26 million investment in this new CARE department is front and center. David, before we get to the nitty-gritty of what CARE would actually do, I want to talk budget overall. Beyond CARE, I'm not thinking we're going to see a lot of major changes to city spending with this mid-biennium budget adjustment here. What are you expecting to see out of the mayor's proposal?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. There's not a lot of extra cash lying around, and so it seems like there was maybe space, if that, for one kind of new announcement, new program that he wanted to do, and it seems like this CARE one is that. I'll be watching the transportation budget a little more closely than the rest of the budget, but I don't expect in that we're going to see any kind of significant changes or anything like that. So, I think if there are new investments or sort of moving things around, it'll happen at the council level. But I think a lot of Mayor Harrell's budget was already baked in.
Yeah. And I will point out, we do have 3 incumbent council members running for re-election looking at this budget. There's always also the overlay of district politics that can affect these numbers. And then you think about Teresa Mosqueda, the budget chair, who's likely going to be on the King County Council next year. I wanted to ask that question about Councilmember Mosqueda. How do you see her guiding this budget process? She's been talking a lot about alternative revenue sources. I wonder how she sends off with what could be her last budget process for the city council.
Yeah, I would be surprised if we saw any of those alternative revenue sources come into play. I wonder, I don't know, but I wonder if there will be a little more fighting over some of the police budget because, this is a bit different than defunding the police, but the council for a few years in a row now has looked at their hiring and seen that they haven't hit their goals, and so therefore have tried to sort of claw back some of the dollars that were available for staffing that the Seattle Police Department didn't end up using. That always ends up being pretty controversial, but at a time when there's not a lot of extra cash going around, I suppose that could be a fight we see again. We've talked about it before, but perhaps there'd be some conversation around the jumpstart tax. I guess I'd be surprised if they raised it significantly, but it's one of the few revenue sources that seems to be kind of stable or even maybe a little bit more than they had expected. So I'm sure there will be some wrangling there, but we'll get a better sense. I don't expect this budget season to be any kind of, radical reshaping of how city government is functioning or funded, just because of the realities of the budget not being what it was a few years ago.
Yeah, very good point there. And I just wanted to get back to CARE for 1 minute, because I think this is an important part of what the mayor is putting out there and something the city council has been talking about for a while here too. So folks, this is the reimagined version of the Community Safety and Communication Center, the CSCC we've talked about before. So the mayor is now calling this CARE, and he wants to increase the CARE budget by 30% in 2024 and bring on 13 new full-time staff. So a proposed budget of $26.5 million compared to $20 million right now. This will diversify the 911 call response system to help with those non-emergency calls like person down, etc. CARE will have 3 divisions, just to give you the background here: emergency call takers and dispatchers, behavioral health responders, and community violence intervention specialists. And a big part of this, a dual dispatch program launching in October that will send out behavioral health experts as well as police to person down calls, for example, which is not exactly what other cities are doing across the country, where behavioral health experts often go solo on these calls. David, I just wanted to get your take on this. Do you see this as the city putting police on these calls because they really want to be careful about rolling out this program? Are they being too careful, meaning this won't really turn into an alternate response? What do you think?
It's not actually that new to send out some kind of behavioral mental health folks with police. They've been doing that. I a couple years ago went out with an officer who was specifically on the crisis response, and there was somebody from DESC who traveled around with him. So that is not new. I think the dispatch thing. I mean, we've talked about this before, but in some ways, the most challenging and perhaps underrated part of creating an alternative response system is how you handle the dispatch side of it. Because you see some studies or whatever that say, 70% of calls didn't need a police officer. I don't remember what the number is, but
right.
The counter argument that SPD has
more than
made
half,
is, it's easy to say that in retrospect, but sort of identifying those at the time is really the challenging part. So knowing in real time when an officer is needed and when it's not. So I think the fact that officers aren't being stripped out entirely sort of shows the caution there, that they're not convinced, I don't think, that they're going to get it right away. Maybe down the road it becomes kind of more of an exclusive behavioral health response, but apparently there's not faith that we can nail that from the jump.
Yeah, and I guess it was interesting to hear too, David, Mayor Harrell, he was talking about this during the press conference about CARE. He actually said, hey, union members of police, emergency services, I see you and hear you. But he also said the public is calling for this diversified response. I just wanted to ask that further question of how do you see this CARE department impacting labor negotiations for SPOG, let's say, the police guild there, which hasn't had a contract now for almost 3 years. What do you think about that labor piece? I think that's a very, very important part of this too.
Yeah, I don't know. Frankly, SPOG is unlikely to let any sort of leverage point go by. So if they see this as a point of leverage, I'm sure they would use it. At the same time, officers have been. I don't know that officers in general love, responding to behavioral health crises. So the time I have spoken to people in law enforcement or the Seattle Police Department, I've never heard any disagreement that there could be other people responding to some of these calls. So, this isn't like new oversight or new accountability necessarily, or things that could get them fired. This is, in theory, picking up some of the work that officers have said in the past that they don't love doing. Again, though, if it's seen as a point of leverage and seen as an opportunity to leverage more pay, then I would imagine that SPOG would use that.
Yeah. A last piece on this, David. I thought it was very interesting to hear last week about Health 99. This is the Seattle Fire Department unit that responds specifically to overdose calls, and we have had so many of those this year. Looks like we're going to break another record in King County in terms of overdose deaths. But 2 months in, this pilot program, Health 99, has responded to 68 calls, had 20 client follow-ups. But I thought it was very interesting. Your Seattle Times colleague, Sarah Grace Taylor, pointed out the response may look promising, but there's still not that many places to take people who might need extra help. And I just wanted to take this a little bit further with CARE. Is that fact going to hamper the success of CARE, too, when you talk about rolling out these 911 alternatives?
Yeah. I think in the same way that lack of housing is always going to be the kind of major bottleneck in solving the homelessness crisis, I think lack of drug treatment or options for people struggling with addiction is always going to be the thing that gets in the way of addressing the fentanyl crisis. So, yes, I imagine that that's always, that's the elephant in the room, that you can create better funnels, but if they're not funneling to anything in particular, then it's kind of a question mark of how much good they're doing.
Yeah, I know, just in terms of where people are actually able to go. And I wonder about that with the CARE program. We'll see what the city council talks about that, or talks about when it comes to that with this budget process going ahead, and what other budget issues they're going to come up with too. Again, the Seattle Mayor Bruce Harrell is talking about this with his budget presentation on Tuesday of this week. We'll be following up on this next week as well. But a lot still ahead with this issue when it comes to the budget and the CARE department too. Thank you for diving into that with me there, David. All right, well, up next, a look at a sidewalk ordinance that looks like good news for pedestrians. But what does it mean when it comes to our property taxes? That's coming up on Now Hear This. All right, so we all know that sidewalks are in rough shape around the city of Seattle. A 2018 assessment showed we have 11,000 blocks missing sidewalks entirely and 154,000 situations where a sidewalk has a deficiency of some sort. Well, Councilmember Tammy Morales wants to change that by considering a new ordinance that would require new construction projects, repaving, etc., to evaluate existing sidewalk conditions and correct any deficiencies they find.
Advocates shouldn't have to ask for this basic investment every year. Funding sidewalks through the annual budget process is unpredictable and it's inefficient. And setting this benchmark now will allow us to better fund this crucial piece of public infrastructure that provides the equitable access to mobility that streets that are solely made for cars do not provide.
So, David, Councilmember Morales really sees this as setting a benchmark. She had a lot of advocates with her, too. Disability Rights Washington. Mike McGinn was there for his walking nonprofit that he works with as well. This is especially as the council considers what it's going to invest in sidewalks for the Move Seattle renewal, the levy that's coming up for next year. And I look at these sidewalks, and I'm not saying this investment isn't needed, but I just see these costs as so astronomical in terms of adding to this levy in our property taxes. And I should point out here, the bill ultimately gives the SDOT director some leeway when deciding about these sidewalk investments, but when sidewalks are not built, an explanation from SDOT would have to be provided. David, I just wanted to ask you, in looking at this, how much substance is there to this bill? Could it have an impact? Will it have an impact? What do you think?
I think there's some substance. I think we've seen some ordinances or rules like this, at the state level, where it's sort of a way to incorporate, improvements to pedestrian and bike facilities or whatever it might be into sort of daily work. The kind of argument being, governments have long sort of prioritized roadways and arterials, and so this is sort of a way to balance the focus out a little bit. And, I don't doubt that if this passes, this would probably force SDOT into, fixing up some sidewalks. That said, it applies to, mostly to major paving projects like arterials. And, they're not doing those are big projects. They're not doing compared to the scale of need. SDOT isn't doing that many blocks of arterial, so it's not like this is going to solve the problem overnight. And there is the sort of the other risk that it makes each project a little more expensive and a little slower, and so there's a chance that it means that some of the paving priorities or whatever that SDOT had previously laid out don't get done. That said, that there's no one who doesn't kind of the proponents on behalf of this bill understand that and, see it as a perfectly good trade-off, because sidewalks in the city are really a problem. The city is still under a federal consent decree to fix its curb ramps because they were seen as widely out of compliance with the Americans with Disability Act. Not even to mention just the basic state of the sidewalks are areas where there are missing sidewalks, which, if you're a wheelchair user or visually impaired, or, even if you have a kid and are pushing them in a stroller, you see pretty quickly how inconvenient and how disruptive this is to your daily life. And so, people think about paving projects as being important to getting around, but sidewalks are, for many people, just as, if not more important. So I think there is substance. I also don't think it's going to lead to an immediate and dramatic reshaping of the city's sidewalks overnight.
Right. And I guess I just wanted to ask that larger question of why sidewalks get the short end of the stick all the time, it seems like. The stats show 1 in 3 Americans can't or don't drive. I just guess the 2 out of 3 who do drive are speaking a lot more loudly. What do you get out of that discrepancy there, David?
Yeah, there's that. I mean, there's the historical focus, but then there's also, it's a little wonky because technically, private property owners hold responsibility for the state of the sidewalk in front of their house. And so that demands, under that system, in theory, the way it's supposed to work is like if the city sees that a sidewalk is deficient and a property owner hasn't done anything about it, there is an enforcement mechanism to make the property owner fix up the sidewalk and spend money to do that. It's really expensive, though, and in the history of that law, the city of Seattle has never enforced it. It's not a thing that's happening, but it does kind of make it so I think the responsibility for maintaining these sidewalks falls into this limbo. Combined with just how expensive it is, it's just for years, I think, just been easier to not do anything about it and not accept responsibility for it.
Right. And it's interesting to see when this bill is getting presented in front of the council, because they're going to be knee deep in budget considerations over the next several weeks here leading up to November. And I wonder at that. I think this is definitely something that Councilmember Morales is trying to put her name out there. She's also running for re-election, by the way. And so I know she's really trying to push for this, but how much the city council can really commit to this during a budget process that, as you mentioned, not a ton of extra dollars floating around there. I'm really wondering how this sets the tone when it comes to the Move Seattle levy for next year. And so that's the long-term discussion I think we're going to be having here. So thanks for engaging on that one. Sidewalks are always an interesting issue in the city of Seattle, have been for decades here. I do want to talk about another issue here, David. I saw an interesting piece in Publicola recently about City Attorney Ann Davison. She signed an amicus brief, a friend of the court brief this week, asking the U.S. Supreme Court to overturn a Ninth Circuit District Court ruling that restricts how cities can criminalize sleeping in public places. This happened down in Grants Pass, Oregon, a few years ago. Now, the brief says this ruling takes local authority and autonomy away from a complex problem and essentially compels the city to provide shelter. Davison points out in the brief that 52% of people in a 2021 study in Seattle turned down an offer of shelter, making this situation really untenable for the city. I just see this as a really existential issue dealing with homeless people here, David. What do you make of what Ann Davison is asking for? Do you see the court overturning its decision here? This is a big issue when it comes to homelessness and how cities deal with it.
Yeah, I don't know. I have no insight into the sort of chances of this getting elevated higher or being overturned. It doesn't surprise me that Ann Davison signed on to this amicus brief. Frankly, I think there are probably other elected officials in the city who probably agree with her, but maybe a little more quietly. Davison, though, I mean, this is what she ran on. She never kept secret. I guess anyone who has been paying attention to Ann Davison through the campaign and during her time in office isn't surprised that this is a decision she'd want to be turned over. Like I said, I wouldn't be surprised if, people in the mayor's office or on the city council also would not mind having this turned over, but it is a little politically tricky because you're basically saying we want to be able to move homeless people from public spaces without being required to offer them shelter, which is, maybe that's kind of happening already, but it's still making it explicit in that way is a little uncomfortable. It's an uncomfortable political reality, and in some ways an acknowledgement that it is that there's not often enough solutions or enough space for people, and yet there are folks in the city who still want to move them from public spaces.
Right. And I guess the bottom line for me, and Erica Barnett made this point very clearly in Public Cola, even with a court decision, let's say it does get overturned, making it easier to sweep homeless camps doesn't make homelessness go away. And I think that's the bottom line that I always come to with this in terms of, okay, what's our overall goal here? Do you think these sweeps will actually end homelessness? And I just don't know if that's the case. It certainly hasn't proved to be over the past several years.
No, it won't. I think about 12th and Jackson, for example, when Bruce Harrell became mayor, he kind of made a big show of flooding the zone and cleaning up the area and moving people out and, kind of staking his claim in the mayor's office. And it was this big to do. If you go by there now, it is not clear any of that ever happened. There are lots of folks there, a lot of homelessness, a lot of drug use. And so, I think that is the kind of reality. I mean, I suppose, for people who live in the area or businesses in the area, sweeps give them the opportunity to kind of hit a reset and maybe clean up the space a little bit. But we have been talking about sweeps and how to do them or how not to do them as long as I have been reporting in Seattle. So at least since 2014, and we're still here talking about it, and it certainly has not proven to solve homelessness.
No, this is such a big issue, and that legal piece of it is a very important part of how to approach this issue. So we'll keep an eye on that and keep an eye on what happens with that brief that was filed by City Attorney Ann Davis and a number of other cities around the country, San Diego, a number of cities in North Dakota. It's a long list of people who are very interested in this at the city level as well. So thanks for jumping on that one with me there, David. All right, well, coming up, the high cost of major transportation projects has turned into an economic problem in more ways than one for our state. David has the story on a troubling trend coming up on Transportation Talk. David, you wrote recently in the Seattle Times about a major conundrum when it comes to the cost of major transportation projects in our state. Those costs are going up, which you would think companies would be jumping on that. Maybe they're going to make more money out of this, but the state's just not getting as many bids for them. What's going on here?
Yeah, this is a real problem, especially, this is right at the beginning of this big push by the state to build a lot of transportation projects. Same in at the federal level. There's a lot of money out there for transportation, but costs of projects are just going way up. So the most recent one is the 520 bridge over Portage Bay, so between Montlake and I-5. The engineers at the state estimated it should cost around $800 million, somewhere between $700 to $900 million. The only two bids came in, and the lower of the two was for $1.3 billion. So $500 million over the engineer's estimate. And the other one was $1.6 billion, I think. So not any better, obviously. And so, there are some sort of obvious and well discussed reasons for that. On the one hand, cost of supplies are up, supply chain issues, things like that, staffing to a certain extent. But the engineers know all this and factor that into their estimates, and they're still undershooting what the bids are by quite a bit. And I think a lot of it is has to do with the fact that the state is just getting not very many bids for these projects at all. And the reasons for that are sort of complicated, but it boils down to there's a lot of work out there. It used to just be that Washington was one of few places that had a lot of work out on the street, but with the federal infrastructure bill, the whole country has a lot of work out there. Of course, there's Sound Transit doing its big projects, and so contractors now have a lot more choices. But at the same time, they're struggling with staffing, so are a little more constrained in how much they can do. Some of these government projects are pretty risky. And so what we're seeing is they're being choosy in what they bid on. And when they do bid on something, they're quoting really high prices because they want to kind of cover their risk. And so it's a conundrum that really has the chance to upend the state's ambitions for its transportation system.
And what does it mean for future budget projects or how the state puts together its transportation budget? It just seems like it's going to be really hard to project what costs are going to be a few years from now if we keep going at this rate.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you think about $1.3 billion for 520. That money would come if they were to award this contract. That money would come from a few different places. But the 16-year transportation plan that they passed a couple years ago was $17 billion. So we're talking, I don't know exactly what the percentage is, but 5% of this entire budget or whatever it might be, just for one, basically like half-mile stretch of road. Of course, it's complicated,
Wow.
but it means that the sort of ambitious goals of that plan, because that plan was more than just sort of continuing down the road. I mean, it was supposed to electrify the ferry fleet and build out transit, and there were some sort of lofty ambitions in that. But suddenly, you're kind of doing the math and thinking that maybe a lot of that budget is going to get eaten up just doing the projects we have already said or already begun doing, or already said we're going to do, let alone starting new stuff, is going to be pretty challenging. So, already they're talking about scaling back some things or even finding new money to continue on this, but none of those are going to be easy politically.
Wow. I was going to say, and just bottom line, we just won't see as many projects built, or like you say, scaling back on some of these things? Possibly.
Or again, the state kind of goes back to the well and finds more money. None of this even touches on the fact that the last transportation budget that was passed in this last session in 23 contained almost no money for maintenance and preservation. So that money was supposed to kind of go toward finishing these big mega projects that were started under the previous transportation package. So, even if we were to do those, I mean, there's basically no money left over to take care of the many, many projects that need maintenance and preservation. So $17 billion sounded like a lot when lawmakers passed it, but when you start kind of going through the list of what needs to be done and how expensive all those things are getting, suddenly it doesn't look like as much as it was.
Wow. That's a lot of loose ends with this, and I appreciate the piece you put together here, David, because I'm sure there's some more reporting coming on that one soon. Thank you very much, but it is time to wrap up, my friend. I thought I would get one more dry weekend, David, to get the tomatoes out of the garden, but I'm not sure how it's looking. I just have to ask my gardening friend here, is it time to shut down things for the year when it comes to my backyard garden? What do you got for me?
Not all things, some of the, maybe your squash and potatoes or whatever can go on for a little longer, but we harvested what I imagine will be the last of our tomatoes, because what's out there now with all this rain is just gonna rot pretty quick. So I think that rain might have spelled the end of tomato season in the Northwest.
Very well. I know it's always a good run while it lasts, but hopefully we get a couple of pumpkins coming out of there. All right. Well, David, thank you as always for helping me out here on Seattle News, Views and Brews. And thanks everybody listening here. This is the spot where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. This podcast is on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, wherever you listen, you're listening to this show. And please also find Seattle News, Views and Brews on Patreon. Really need you there, folks. Show your support if you would. Thanks for watching on Converge Media too. We'll see you next time. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2023.